nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Madhupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jadamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Murakedato Vande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kado Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambhojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-strinam dantoyer yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haiturastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasada Smaratam Vrajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Parapadme Bhakter Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jad Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva tasyai namah Yaram Nikilaga Sangha Shamani Shrotratritim Sangata Yaram Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the Kris Jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. So we're here in this brief section on Mokṣa Anadar, or disregard for Mokṣa. The previous section, Bhaktas Utkanta, their intense covetousness of bhakti, of Bhagavan's darshan, of Bhagavan's lila. This is for real. Or in other words, this is really what they want over and above even moksha. It is their purushartha. Prem is the purushartha. In idealistic terms, according to our Goswami Siddhanta, in the hearts of such great poets and great Vaishnavas as are praised here in this text, and as we aspire shall become deeply situated in our heart. In other words, that other vasanas, other desires may be purged from the psyche, such that really, really, prem is our purushartha. So, one of the symptoms of prem being one's purushartha is that one disregards even moksha, which is conventionally held to be the ultimate purushartha. So in the last class, we discussed some of the gist of Jiva Goswami's analysis of the subject of moksha and its discussion of its 5 types based on the Priti Sandarbha. So today we'll hear the remainder of this brief section on moksha. So I'm picking up from a fresh file on verse 111. Next, the compiler cites a verse of Sri Hanuman, wherein he explains why moksha is disregarded by those who follow the path of Uttama Bhakti. Bhava-bandha-cchide tasyai spṛhayāmi na muktaye bhavān prabhur ahaṁ dāsa yatra vilupyate. I do not desire that which cuts away the bondage of material existence, mukti, and in which this relation between us, you are my master and I am your servant, is lost. So Hanuman is evidently speaking to Ram and saying, I don't want moksha or mukti. I don't want anything that would jeopardize this relationship that we have, this opportunity that I have to be your servant and you to be my master. So this verse is cited also in the Sindhu, it's cited also in the Sandarbhas, and it's cited also in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. So when Sri Rupapad, Sri Sanatanpad, Sri Jivapad are all weaving this in, then we know this is something that was really captures the essence of an important point. So in our discussion here, we'll visit through some of the ways that this verse is discussed by them in those texts. So, it is described in Brihad Bhagavatamrita that when Sri Narada visits Sri Hanuman and speaks to Sri Hanuman at length as to why Hanuman should be considered the recipient of the greatest grace from Sri Bhagavan, he concludes his praises of Hanuman with a reference to the verse under discussion. So, I think everyone is familiar. The first kanda of the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, the narrative is framed around Narada's search for who has received the most grace, or grace of the greatest order, of the greatest quality, from Bhagavan. And in the course of doing that, he goes to one bhakta, that bhakta says, no, not me, go to another. He goes to that person says, no, not me, go to another. And like this, he goes on. And in the course of that, he comes to Hanuman. So he praises Hanuman based on what he's heard about Hanuman from others, and makes a case, if you will, why Hanuman is the recipient of the greatest grace of Bhagavan. And as this is written, usually there's an ordering of the importance of what is said towards the end. So to prevent redundancy, things are, and also to make it, graspable, simpler things are said later, and then the points of ultimate import are given at the conclusion. So this verse that we're discussing now is the point that Narada mentions last in that analysis. So this we can understand to really be at the heart of what Narada is perceiving to be Hanuman's greatness. So he said, I'm missing the footnote here. Sorry about that. I'll have to link that in later, sorry. I'll just read the translation. Aho, you are verily endowed with completely pure bhakti. You who are verily endowed with completely pure bhakti, and who do not consider anything else superior to the bliss of service to Prabhu, that is Bhagavan, spoke to Prabhu, the greatest of the magnificent, this statement completely delighting to his bhaktas. So he's referring to our verse. So in other words, what we can draw from this is that this verse, this statement of Hanuman, it brings great delight to Bhaktas. Evidently, it brought great delight to Rup Sanatan and Jiva Goswami for their inclusion of it in their works. So, Sanatan Pad further explains in his commentary that the quality of Sri Hanuman being praised here, because it is exhibited in the verse under discussion, is his greatness in forever having fondness solely for bhakti by virtue of his indifference to all else. In other words, you can't really have desire or relish or fondness only for bhakti if you have relish for other things at the same time. So when really you relish only bhakti, then you don't have any concerns, or you're indifferent to everything apart from that. So it should be observed that Sri Narada's placement of the mention of this quality last, amid the numerous qualities of Sri Hanuman that he praises, indicates that this is a preeminent quality of Sri Hanuman, and more broadly of all Uttama Bhaktas. So anya bilashita shunyata, this non-desirousness of anything other than bhakti, this is one of the essential characteristics of Uttama Bhakti. So here, this is shown in an Uttama Bhakta. So if the bhakti has no desirousness of anything other than bhakti, then the bhakta harbors no such desire. And because they're, quote, indifferent to all else, then really they are bhakti ak abhilash, as Jiva Goswami comments there. They have desire only for bhakti. Sri Sanatan Pad also explains that the verse under discussion is described as, quote, completely delighting to his bhaktas, tad-bhakta-gana pramodini, because of its being indicative of Sri Hanuman's rejection from afar of mukti, out of regard solely for bhakti, because of mukti's being antithetical to bhakti, which can be understood in accord with the aforecited statements of the compiler in this regard from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So we already discussed those verses last time, that the Uttama Bhakta is Sevaika Madhurya Jusha, or they're a relisher of the sweetness only of seva to Bhagavan. So they don't even want that bliss of the seva with prema that's overlaying some personal pleasure in being liberated. They don't even want an overlay. They just want that and only that. So this is the point we referred to previously. So that's what's alluded to here. So in other words, for bhaktas who feel that way or who cherish that as their ideal, when they see instances of bhaktas expressing that spirit, of expressing the joy of having such a state of mind, or having such desirousness within them, then this resonates. This, swells the heart. It brings, joy to be reminded of that blessedness. Also, Sri Bhagavan's being described as, quote, the greatest of the munificent, Udara Shekaram, also indicates that the verse under discussion was spoken by Sri Hanuman to Bhagavan Ram, when Bhagavan Ram was readily offering to grant Hanuman everything, any and all boons, be it mukti or anything else he so desired. So it's one thing to say, yeah, I don't want that, but you're not even qualified for it anyway, or it's not even available to you anyway. But it's another thing to decline it when it's being handed to you on a silver platter, so to speak. It's ripe for the taking right in front of you. Then it's harder to say no. It's only truly that you're not interested that you won't accept it in that case. That this is the context of the statement is also affirmed in a verse from the Narayana Vyuhastava in Hayashirsha Pantaratra, cited by the compiler immediately prior to his citation of the verse under discussion in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So Rupa Goswami, in other words, prefaces his citation of this verse with the following verse in the Sindhu. He says, Yadrichaya labdamapi Vishnur dasharates tuyaha naichan moksham vinadasyam tasyai hanumate namah. Obeisance unto him, Hanuman, who without servitude did not desire even moksha, obtained fortuitously right from Vishnu, the son of Dasarath. So in other words, well, I'll just read it. It says, the sense is thus that Sri Hanuman had as though already attained mukti, since Sri Bhagavan had readily offered to grant him this. And in the verse under discussion, he replies to this offer, quote, I do not desire that which cuts away the bondage of material existence, mukti. So, by citing this verse from another place, right before this verse, Rupa Goswami implies that that Hanuman had mukti. It was there for the taking for him. In other words, he'd done far more than what would be required or be the required merit to be fit to receive mukti. He was well qualified, so to speak, but nevertheless disinterested. And then the reason is given. In other words, okay, he didn't want it, but why didn't he want it? He says, I do not desire that which cuts away the bondage of material existence. So typically people want mukti because they want to be free from the bondage of material existence. They want to be free from suffering. So if he doesn't want mukti, that means he's either not suffering or he's not concerned about removing the possibility of him suffering. So why not? Sri Sanatana Pad takes it that the bondage of material existence refers to the bondage of samsara in the form of birth, death, and so on. So there's inherent suffering in birth, death, and other things that take place in this world. So how could one whose psyche is constructed to pursue sukh and avoid dukh say, yeah, this place that has perpetual dukh, I'm fine with that? How would they be ready to take on a state of perpetual subjection to dukh if the psyche is built to avoid dukh and seek sukh? Because they must be experiencing such sukh that even that dukh that's inherent to material existence is irrelevant to them. When Hanuman, in this way, does not accept Bhagavan's offering of the boon of mukti, then Sri Bhagavan asks, mukti is a cause of attaining absolute bliss, preceded by an absolute cessation of suffering. Why don't you desire this? In other words, everybody wants sukh without dukh, and mukti is that which completely removes dukh and gives you never-ending sukh, so how could you say no? Sri Hanuman explains his reasoning in the second half of the verse. Quote, mukti is that wherein the distinction that you, Bhagavan, Sri Ram, are my master, and I, Hanuman, am your servant, is lost. Why don't I want mukti? Because if I accept mukti, then I'll lose the status of being your servant, and I won't have you as my master. So the implication is then that state of being a servant of Bhagavan is so blissful, is so fulfilling, it produces so much sukh, that it makes the dukh inherent in material existence immaterial or irrelevant to someone, and rather readily acceptable, provided that there is sufficient, provided that in that context it enables them to have access to the sukh of seva. Sri Sanatana Pad further explains the suggested sense. Quote, since I do not even desire mukti, on account of the destruction of the bliss of bhakti, as a result of the occurrence of non-duality in mukti, meaning the dissolution of the duality between you and I, which makes bhakti possible, that occurs in sayujya mukti, why would I accept it? In other words, Hanuman is saying, how could I accept mukti? Mukti destroys the duality, between you and I, that duality is necessary to have bhakti to you, to experience you as my master, and mukti will remove that distinction, therefore it will remove that opportunity for bhakti, therefore it will remove the bliss that I feel in that bhakti. And how could I give up that bliss? How could I give up that most blessed, that supreme blessedness, that most sublime experience of bhakti to you? So, I wouldn't even desire it, much less accept it. So this is Mokṣa and Ādhār. Here's our section, disregard for moksha. So here you have it. Disregard for moksha and the reason why. In essence, everybody's pursuing sukh, and there's so much sukh in bhakti that it makes mukti irrelevant. And that's one way of looking at it. Another sense is that the bhakta feels so deeply identified with the state of being a servant of Bhagavan, of being Bhagavan's bhakta, that they just can't even think outside of that. The idea of pursuing or desiring something that would do away with that state of their very identity and that relationship that pervades and informs every thought, word, and deed in their life, it just doesn't even come up in their mind. So they wouldn't even desire it, let alone accept such a thing. Okay, so we have a couple more verses on the same topic to conclude the section. Next, the compiler cites a verse in which disregard for moksha is conveyed through an expression of disapproval of those who desire it. Hanta citrīyate mitra smṛtvā mama mānasam vivekino'pi kuryus tṛṣṇām ahaṁ laye. Hanta, O friend, my mind is astonished, remembering they who, although discerning, can foster desire for absolute dissolution. In other words, I don't get it. These people, they have a brain, but then they pursue the last thing that you would ever want to do if you were using it properly. This is how you might put it in more colloquial language. So, the particle hanta is in the sense of lamentation. The astonishment is in the sense of wondering, what is this? The author considers the discerning, that is, those who have the capacity to distinguish between essence and non-essence. So discerning, or vivekina, means those who have what is called vivek, or discernment. So he's then giving a definition. What is discernment? It means the capacity to distinguish between what is of the essence and what is not. What is sar and asar. So sarasar vivek. This is a common way that it's defined. Or sarasar vichar, sarasar vivechana. In various ways you'll see commentators make this point. So here I've given it as essence. You could also say good and not good, or the best and what is not the best, or right and wrong, however you want to put it. So to discern is, in other words, to be able to assess the value of things accurately, which implies one can assess the essential nature of objects by identifying their characteristics. So by the capacity to recognize characteristics, one can determine the essential nature of particular objects, and by knowing the nature of objects, one can understand their relative value, such that whether they are, quote, of the essence or not of the essence, whether they are desirable or undesirable, what have you. So that ability for discernment of objects is called vivek. So he's saying the author considers the discerning to be objects of lamentation. In other words, people who have this faculty but who don't use it properly or who misuse it, we lament for such people. We feel sad, we feel sorry for that, when they foster desire for absolute dissolution. In other words, when they have this precious faculty, but they use it for something that doesn't lead to their own good. something like someone might be, a genius, but then decide to use that genius for thievery or for some other, nefarious activity, where they definitely exercise their intelligence and they definitely pursue something that seems desirable, but unfortunately it has a tragic or a sad implication because it's not truly in their best interest. So they're utilizing the intellect to a certain extent, but where it really matters in that respect, they haven't made the right analysis. So, the discerning are, the author considers the discerning to be objects of lamentation when they foster desire for sayuja mukti. The implied sense being that the author, by virtue of profound conviction and fixity in bhakti to Bhagavan, finds it baffling that persons who are blessed with the special faculty for discernment found only in human life, that is, the intellect, buddhi. So what we just defined here as vivek? What enables one to have or to do vivek? That faculty is called the buddhi, one of the four elements of the inner instrument, or the antakaran, as it's given in the Bhagavad Samkhya. So, those who are blessed with the special faculty for discernment found only in human life, that is the buddhi, which according to the Bhagavatam is, quote, that by which one can attain direct experience of Bhagavan, Brahmavalokana-dhishana. So, this is from a statement in the 11th canto where it says that all the different entities throughout the universe were manifest except the human, and then finally when the human was manifest, the only entity that had buddhi, or that had, the antakaran that travels with every, conditioned jiva has a buddhi, but what essentially it means is that in human life, it's only in human life that faculty of the buddhi has the chance to function or to flourish. And the primary utility of that faculty is that it's that by which one can attain experience of Bhagavan. So the buddhi is that by which one can attain experience of Bhagavan. So, does that imply that experience of Bhagavan is just quote-unquote something intellectual? No, that sort of connotation that the word intellectual has in English, we wouldn't want to apply that to this English translation of the term buddhi in this context in the Bhagavatam. The buddhi is something that, although we might call it the intellect in English, doesn't have the exact same semantic range or fit the exact same parameters of what we call intellect in English. So the buddhi is also that faculty which performs the function of recognition of objects based on past samskaras. So it's actually that by which we can have, what they call savikalpa perception, or, this distinct or, a defined sense of perceiving particular objects. So all the emotions and all the, ideas and all of the, objects that we perceive are all mediated by the function of the intellect, the buddhi rather. So it's a far broader scope than merely what might popularly be called the intellect in English. And here what the Bhagavatam is also emphasizing is that it's that faculty which enables one to have experience of Bhagavan. So oftentimes we hear, Bhagavan is beyond the material senses and the material mind, so, you can never conceive of him. And yet here it's saying that is that which leads to experience of him. So the implication is that actual darshan of Bhagavan, or experience of Bhagavan, does happen through the faculty of the quote-unquote material intellect, when the functions of the Swarup Shakti guide and are imbued into that intellect. So in that sense, the intellect is still a quote, what you would in the philosophical sense call the material cause of the effect called anubhav, or the effect called darshan of Bhagavan. And in addition to that, I would say that the primary sense of the use of the term here in this passage in the Bhagavatam is not what I just referred to, which you would get in, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, 3rd chapter after Bhava Bhakti is defined, but the idea that the intellect is what enables us to study Shastra. The intellect is what enables us to become fundamentally educated in language, culture, coherent thought, the whole, richness of human life. That is the premise of following a path that can lead to direct experience of the Paratattva. So that would be the primary sense of it here. So when the purpose of having that intellect is to take up a path that leads to anubhav of Brahman, and specifically this analysis is being given from a follower of the Bhakti Marg perspective, where Savishesh Brahman, Bhagavan, is considered to be a higher order of, absolute spiritual aesthetic order, and thus that it's lamentable that someone would pursue only experience of Nirvishesh Brahman instead. So all that combined is the implied sense. So I'll just read this here. The implied sense being that the author, by virtue of profound conviction and fixity in bhakti to Bhagavan, finds it baffling that persons who are blessed with the special faculty for discernment found only in human life, that is, the intellect, buddhi, which according to Srimad Bhagavatam is that by which one can attain direct experience of Bhagavan, do not succeed in using this invaluable and elsewhere unattainable faculty to directly experience Sri Bhagavan, there's a typo, and thus feel the superlative bliss of Uttama Bhakti to him, and rather make use of it only to pursue the ultimate eternal opposite of direct experience of Sri Bhagavan and Bhakti to him, namely Sayuja Mukti. So my mind is astonished when I remember those people that although they have a buddhi, although they have the capacity for vivek, they desire Sayuja Mukti instead of Bhagavad Darshan, instead of Bhagavad Bhakti. Oh, so Hanta, then oh, how sad. So what does that expression of bafflement and that emotive expression of this particle Hanta, what does it convey? It conveys moksha anadar. That's how it fits here in the Prakaran. So by saying, I'm astonished, how can these people do that? The implication is, I have such a disregard for mukti, I can't even relate to, I can't even think about how someone would prefer that over bhakti. So if Rupa Goswami's purpose is citing, bringing this section here to say that bhakta's desire for bhakti is absolute, then here you have it. It's so deeply fixed in this person's mind that they can't even remember that other people don't think the way they do, or it just becomes strange that people don't think the way they do, which is not uncommon for any mentality, right? We say, Atmavan manyate jagat, that the world is, seen like the self. In other words, there's a natural tendency to assume that other people see the world the way that we do. So when someone is steeped in a particular way of thinking, they may even lose awareness of the fact that not everyone sees it in the same way. It's just how everything is to them, so to speak. So in that way, this richly conveys such disregard for moksha. In other words, someone might say, oh, it's too bad that those people pursue that, but we know, we feel convinced and fulfilled to pursue this. But they can somehow relate to or understand that someone might pursue something else, and they just don't prefer that. But to say, I just don't get it, how could you do that? That's a stronger way of showing how steeped in this desire for bhakti and disregard for moksha someone is. So, a rich contribution to this section. All right, then one more. Next, the compiler concludes this section on disregard for mukti with a verse in which a bhakta, cut that word, in which a bhakta speaks to mukti personified, present directly before him, and thereby clearly shows the disregard that bhaktas foster towards mukti. So this verse is like a compressed conversation where you have to read in where the quote marks start and stop. And in this case, it's pretty self-evident because it follows a linear progression. Sometimes there are verses written like this that also aren't linear. Those are a bit harder, but this one's pretty straightforward. Kvatam muktirupagatasmi bhavati kasmadiha śrī-kṛṣṇa-smaraṇena deva bhavato dāsī-padaṁ prapita dure tishtamanaganagasikvatam kuryat anaryam mayi tvad-gandhān nija-nāma-candana-rasālepasya lopo bhavet. Who are you? I'm Mukti, present before you. Why have you come here all of the sudden? O Deva, by virtue of your remembrance of Śrī-kṛṣṇa, I have been delegated the position of your maidservant. Stay away! Why do you act so... Why should you act rudely towards me, who am not in the wrong in the least? Just because of your scent, loss of the anointment of the sandalwood paste of my own good name shall occur. So like a fine gentleman freshly anointed with his sandalwood paste saying, "Get away! Your stench will distort the smell of my sandalwood paste." So we go through some point-by-point analysis on this one, so I'll just jump into it. Mukti's response to the first question, "Who are you?" suggests that it is generally common for aspirants of realization of some form of the paratattva to eagerly await the day they attain mukti. And thus Mukti, as though confidently introduces herself, "I am Mukti, present before you," because she assumes, these aspirants will be highly glad to receive her. In other words, if you are the delivery man for someone and they're calling you going, "Get here as quick as possible," and then you show up and say, "Here I am with your package," then you have a certain confidence. Here I am. You're certain that the person is going to be glad to see you and receive you well. So it's as if Mukti's arriving ready, as if assuming that the person is going to be very glad that they're here. And when the person says, "Who are you?" "I'm Mukti, right here. I've finally come to you." So the Bhakta's next question, "Why have you come here all of a sudden?" And there's some play in Sanskrit here because kasmat, akasmat is, the word kasmat here means why. And then akasmat is also a negation of, it's a negative form of the same word, but it's also conventionally it has the common meaning of suddenly or it comes from this idea of without cause, but it's acquired the meaning of just something that happens fast that you don't know why. So he sort of puts those two together. And so he says, "Bhavati kasmad akasmadiha." So why have you come here all of the sudden implies that the bhakta perceives mukti as an uninvited guest, thus suggesting that a bhakta fosters no desire for mukti. So in other words, this bhakta is not happy to see this mukti arriving here. It wasn't like a long-awaited old friend or an eagerly anticipated guest. It was like, "What did you come here out of the blue?" Mukti begins her reply by saying, "O Deva," that is, O playful one. So deva comes from div. One of the meanings of the root div is to play. So the commentator is taking it in that sense, that it's Mukti feels embarrassed. Like, I've just come here, I'm here before you. And then the person's like, what are you doing here? And then the person's like, oh God, like, here you go, oh playful, Lord, why did you put me in this situation? So, O Deva, to indicate that Sri Bhagavan is playful in sending her even to bhaktas who do not desire her or understand why she has come. So she's like, oh Deva, like, you certainly send me out here on some interesting missions. Then she explains, by virtue of your remembrance of Sri Krishna, I have been delegated the position of your maidservant. The implied remainder being that Sri Bhagavan has sent her because he is pleased with the bhakti being offered by this bhakta, and that the bhakta is free to accept her assistance in his that the bhakta is free to accept her assistance in, I guess it should just be in service to him. Sorry, a little sloppy here. So she's explaining, Bhagavan here has sent me to be your maidservant. I'm now at your disposal. When the bhakta replies, stay away, and Mukti asks, why should you act rudely towards me, who am not in the wrong in the least? She implies that she has not committed any offense to the bhakta. She just arrived, and therefore he is acting improperly by immediately sending her away. In other words, she's very politely come and introduced herself to just immediately be sent away for having done nothing wrong and acted perfectly appropriately. This would seem like, a fault on the part of the bhakta. So the bhakta explains why. The bhakta then explains that it is not that she has acted improperly, but that he feels an impropriety will arise on his part if he receives her. No, I'm not telling you to get out because there's anything that you've done. I'm telling you to get out because it'll be wrong of me to let you stay here. So he says, just because of your scent, loss of the anointment of the sandalwood paste of my own good name shall occur. So, this is definitely an embedded cultural example. So, typically a person, if they're a guest of honor at an assembly, they're anointed with sandalwood paste, which is a rare, precious substance, which is cooling and pleasing and so forth. So to use sandalwood paste as a metaphor for having a good name or being in a state of honorability is a nice metaphor, an appropriate metaphor. And then he's sort of playing with the metaphor by speaking about the fragrance of mukti, because sandalwood paste is something known to be fragrant. So, I'll lose this anointment of sandalwood paste that I have, meaning I'll lose my own good name if I accept you. The commentator comments, on a variant reading of name instead of scent to convey an implied, this should be that. The commentator comments that a variant reading of name instead of scent conveys an implied sense that it is as though the names of Sri Bhagavan's bhaktas are written on his feet and other parts of his body with sandalwood paste, and that the bhakta in this verse considers that his name so written there shall vanish from the body of Sri Bhagavan just because of the name Mukti. Okay, so in this variant, he's saying just by your name, the sandalwood paste of my name will fall off. So he doesn't say where his name is written in sandalwood paste. So the commentator is saying, his name is written in sandalwood paste on Bhagavan's feet, or on Bhagavan's body. We know it's one of the Bhakti-yangas mentioned in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, to wear the names of Bhagavan upon one's own body. Some bhaktas have stamps, and on their upper arms or the chest or elsewhere, they'll stamp or write names of Bhagavan in some variety of chandan. So here he's implying that Bhagavan, similarly or reciprocally, also likes to wear the names of his bhaktas on his body. So this is a way of showing deep love, deep attachment and dearness, that I keep your name on my body, a little bit like in modern culture, people fall in love and then they get a tattoo with so and so and so and so with a heart around it or a heart between it or something. Writing the name on the body is considered one way of showing a depth of love or attachment. So as bhaktas will wear Bhagavan's name on their body, then Bhagavan will also wear the names of his bhaktas on his body. So this bhakta is thinking, my Prabhu, he loves me so much that he even wears my name on his body. Probably he would also wear Bhagavan's name on his body. So he's thinking, we're in love. We have such love for one another that we're wearing each other's names on our bodies. And now this Mukti is coming here. Just the name Mukti will disturb that. In other words, Mukti is something that could become a detriment or a death knell to this deep, loving connection that I have with Bhagavan, for the reasons described in the previous verses, that by Mukti, then the relationship that you are the master, that I am the servant, shall be removed. So he's saying, don't let the name of my name written in sandalwood paste on Bhagavan's body be taken off his body by me ceasing to be a bhakta because of accepting you. So therefore, stay away. I don't accept you, because otherwise my name will fall off Bhagavan's body. This is the way the commentator interprets it. So I've just got a few things in addition to that. This interpretation could also be applied to the reading of scent, in which case the scent of Mukti would cause his name to vanish from the feet of Bhagavan. So you could interpret still the second mention, or the name of his name being written in Bhagavan's body, you could interpret it in that way, and let's say that the smell of Mukti will cause that to fall off, like some type of gas, or something that would come and cause the paste to evaporate and fall off, or something like that. Like this noxious gas of Mukti will come and make the sandalwood fall off of Bhagavan's feet. Something like that, you could also interpret it. If you kept, because as I've mentioned so many times, I'm following the critical edition here of the Padyavali, so in some cases the commentators' readings differ with the critical edition. So anytime that happens, then I usually give both the commentators' reading and some explanation where required of the critical edition's reading. Okay, the commentator further explains that the purport of this interpretation is that because a name is a designation of a body, the loss of a bhakta's name refers to the loss of any type of body when mukti, that is sayuja mukti, occurs. And because a bhakta does not want to lose the privilege of having a body, be it a material or spiritual one, since bhakti to Bhagavan cannot be performed without some type of body, the bhakta thus politely says to Mukti, let there be no relation between me and even your name. That is, please leave me alone, and let me not lose this body which I have, the supremely valuable opportunity, this body with which I have the supremely valuable opportunity to engage in bhakti to Bhagavan. In other words, it's like someone arriving at your door who could kill you. In other words, I could lose the body. I need the body in order to do bhakti. You're showing up. If I accept you, if you come near me, I'll lose my body. If I lose my body, I'll lose my bhakti. If I lose my bhakti, that's everything to me. I'll lose bhagavan. I'll lose everything. So please, stay away. I don't want to lose my body. So, in other words, he's taking it that there's no such thing as a name unless there's an object to which it refers to. We don't have words for things that don't exist. So if there's a word, if there's a name, that implies that there's someone to whom that name or that word is spoken, or about whom or for whom that word functions as a designation. So if we take it in that way, when he speaks of his name, it implies that his personal existence, his embodied existence. This is a second interpretation. So, I've just got a little follow-up to that. Alternately, and more simply, it could also be interpreted that when the Bhakta explains to Mukti, quote, just because of your scent, loss of the anointment of the sandalwood paste of my own good name shall occur, his mention of his own name can refer to whatever name he has as a Dikshita Vaishnav, such as Krishna Das or Shama Das or Ram Das or whatever. In other words, you could also just, rather than this is a name in sandalwood written on Bhagavan's body, or this name just represents my physical body, I'm offering a third interpretation where you could just take it with maybe a less of a stretch and just say when he's mentioning my own name, he just means his own name. He just means my name, Krishna Das, Sham Das, or whatever. So if we take it in that sense, which would be not that these other readings are far-fetched, but it would be, it would require a little bit less consideration to arrive at this premise for an interpretation. Then his mention of his own name can refer to whatever name he has as a Dikshita Vaishnav, and represent his existing as an embodied Vaishnav, such that he conveys to Mukti that his name and present opportunity to engage in bhakti to Sri Bhagavan are comparable to an anointment of sandalwood paste, in that they are delightfully pleasing, just as sandalwood paste is by virtue of its fragrance. And if Mukti remains with him, then he will lose the precious chance he has to retain his name and engage in bhakti, just as one loses the chance to imbibe the fine fragrance of sandalwood when a pervasive foul odor infiltrates one's midst. So you could take it that, she's saying, your fragrance is going to make me lose my name, or the sandalwood paste of my name. So in other words, my name is producing this nice smell of sandalwood, and your fragrance is going to make me lose that. In other words, you smell bad. And your bad smell is going to inhibit the experience of this good smell of sandalwood. And that, quote, good smell of sandalwood is representative of his having a name, or in other words, his being a Dikshita Vaishnav, or his being in good standing as a Vaishnav. So it simply would imply that if I accept you, I'll lose my status as a follower of this path of bhakti, as an aspirant for pure bhakti, and so on. So, this is how you could take it in different ways. The overall import of the verse is quite clear. He's, this exchange, who are you? What have you come here to leave here? I don't want to lose what I have. The whole implication is that the Bhakta has total disregard for moksha. They feel completely fulfilled with bhakti, and they don't want any detriment to potentially arise to that. They perceive Sayuja Mukti as antithetical. So finally, I've just got one other point of reference for this, and we'll conclude, so I might go a few minutes over, pardon me. Howsoever the final statement of the Bhakta is interpreted, the principal import of the verse under discussion, and of this section as a whole, is that a pure Bhakta does not desire any form of mukti, and never accepts Sayuja Mukti even when offered it directly by Bhagavan. Sri Kapila Dev also explains this in verses cited earlier on this subject, explains this in verses cited earlier on this subject and also in the following verse. So this is also something that Rupa Goswami cites in the Sindhu. Naikatmakatam me spṛhayānti kechin matpada-seva virata madiha yanyonyato bhagavata prasajja sabhajayante mama porushani. Some Bhagavatas who are possessed of deep attachment to the service of my feet, whose desire is for me, and who devoutly honor my feats, do not covet oneness with me. So, a very nice, straightforward statement. Bhagavan says, some Bhagavatas who are possessed of deep attachment to the service of my feet, whose desire is for me, and who devoutly honor my feats, do not covet oneness with me. So Bhagavan himself expressing the same idea. They don't want Sayuja Mukti because they have deep attachment to serving me, they desire me, and they love to honor my leelas. So a little commentary from this verse is relevant to our discussion. Sri Sanatan Pad comments that this verse shows bhakti's superiority even to moksha. Sri Jivapad comments that the mention of, quote, some refers to bhaktas who are extraordinary relishers of bhakti rasa. In other words, when he says some Bhagavatas, why is he not saying all Bhagavatas? Because only high Bhagavatas or bhaktas who are experiencing bhakti rasa, only they are really at that such a state of purity that they really desire Bhagavan alone, that they really have deep attachment only to his feet, and so on. So Jiva Goswami reads it like that. And that, quote, oneness refers to Brahma Sayuja as well as Bhagavat Sayuja. Sri Chakravarti Pad further comments as follows. So I'll just read the translation to save time. He says, an objection is raised. Well, by what bliss are they who do not take pleasure in the bliss of Brahman fulfilled? So this is an interesting Purvapaksha. The idea is that the psyche is built to pursue sukh and avoid dukh. If people don't want the bliss of Brahman, then what do they want? What sukh are they getting that's enabled them to turn away from that sukh, which is typically the greatest possible sukh, as many think? So the premise is that everyone's looking after sukh. Brahma sukh people think is the best. Well, they don't even want Brahma sukh. Okay, well then what sukh do they want? To this he says, matpada-seva virata. That is, they are possessed of exceeding attachment with attentiveness to Shastra, solely to service with all the senses to my feet, and not rather to jnana and so on. So, they don't want the bliss of Brahman. What do they want? They are possessed of exceeding attachment, and that attachment has attentiveness to Shastra. In other words, it's not just whimsical emotionality or, fanaticism or what have you. It's an educated, clarified, refined form of attachment, and that attachment is solely to the service of my feet, and that service is performed in full with all of the senses. So their attachment is to that. Means they get sukh out of that that's even greater than the sukh of Brahman. And they're not interested in gyan, meaning the means to attain Brahman, or anything else. By this description of bhaktas being, quote, matpada-seva virata, bhaktis having Bhagavan for its object rather than mukti, being a form of engagement of all the senses, being free from karma, jnana, and so forth, being adherent to Shastra, and being natural are all stated. So, quote, when he says by being natural, means the mind is going to gravitate to whatever produces sukh. This produces great sukh, therefore the mind's going to gravitate to it automatically. In that sense, it's quote unquote natural. Furthermore, bhaktas are, quote, mad iha, which means they whose desire is solely for me. that is solely for relishing my beauty, sweetness, and so forth. Thus, they have an absence of desire for anything else. Annibilashita shunyam. Tvam. So this is a nice point, because in the commentaries on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, in the famous verse, Annibilashita shunyam, there Jiva Goswami comments that means bhakti ek abhilash, that they desire only bhakti and not anything else. So we discussed earlier in a commentary on 83 or 94, I forget, one of the two, here in Padyavali, about a hierarchy of desire, and that within this desirelessness and this non-desirousness of anything other, there nevertheless is also a plurality of desire. There's desire for bhakti, there's desire for bhagavan, there's desire for darshan of bhagavan, there's desire for service to bhagavan. All of these things are, and we showed from the 10th canto and a few other verses how Sanatana Goswami, Jiva Goswami, they show that these are an embedded hierarchy within the oneness of the desire that is integral to Uttama Bhakti, and that all fits the category of being desireless or akinchan, without anything else than that. So this point also nicely supports that same line of thought by here Chakravarti Pad himself explicitly saying that Bhaktas having a desire for Krishna's beauty, for Krishna's sweetness, doesn't violate the non-desirousness principle. Or in other words, non-desirousness of anything else. To desire the experience of Krishna's beauty, sweetness, this is not an extraneous desire or an anya-bilash. So, moving on, they, quote, devoutly, that is, fostering attachment, honor, that is, they relish and offer praises to my feats, that is, the nectars of my leelas, such as lifting Govardhan. Thus, they take no pleasure in the happiness of Brahman. So the implication is that they're still seekers of happiness, but they take such pleasure in perceiving my beauty and my sweetness, in relishing my leelas, that produces so much sukh for them that the sukh from Brahman is irrelevant to them. It's negligible. So he concludes this as follows, saying, thus, they take no pleasure in the happiness of Brahman, because of the absence of the bliss of service to my feet, because of the absence of experience of my beauty, aroma, and so forth, and because of the absence of relishing the nectars of my leelas therein. Means if you absorb the mind in Nirvishesh Brahman, then where will you experience the bliss of serving Krishna? Where will you experience his beauty? Where will you experience the, relish of the nectar of his leela? You won't. Thus, 3 reasons for their not coveting mukti are stated. So why don't they want mukti? Because serving Krishna is so fulfilling, it makes it irrelevant. Why else? Because experiencing, seeing Krishna's beauty, smelling Krishna's fragrance is so wonderful, it makes mukti irrelevant. And why else? Because just talking about Krishna, just hearing about his leelas that are like nectar, just that itself, just the experience of even hearing about Krishna's leela is better than the experience of moksha. And this is a point that Jiva Goswami also makes elsewhere that I think came somewhere in our discussion earlier. That even what to speak of, entering quote-unquote Goloka Vrindavan and directly participating in Leela, just hearing about Leela is more fulfilling than the bliss of Brahman. Or at least it can be, provided that one is engaging in it as it's meant to be done. So, I'll conclude here. I went a little bit over time, so that'll conclude the discussion on this prakaran, Moksha Anadar, disregard for moksha. I added this commentary of Chakravarti Pad just because he gives very explicitly, bang, 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 further reasons for this disregard. So, as a little roadmap, next we come to a verse which lays out what he calls Bhagavad Dharma Tattva, or some of the essential characteristics of Bhagavad Dharma, or in other words, how to observe and engage in various bhakti practices. And this is just one verse, but I don't know what got into me, but I really teed off on this one and ended up going quite long on it. So we'll go for probably quite a number of classes into discussion of the principles that are mentioned in this verse. And also, as a further roadmap, after this verse, there's just one other short section of 3 verses, which are prayers that are offered at the time of offering bhoga. And after that, the entire rest of the book is all about Brajadam and Krishna Lila there. So all talk of moksha and tattvas and, shuddha bhakti and, the ins and outs of sadhana practices and all these kind of things. There isn't any more specifically on that anywhere in the text. The whole last, almost just about 2/3 of the text, we're almost up to 1/3 of the way through, is all discussion of various leelas and analysis of the different states of the nayika and the course of different exchanges and many other wonderful features of Sri Krishna's leela and the prem found only in Braj. So before we finally jump into all of that, we'll have one more quite thorough analysis of a number of technical points regarding Guru Tattva and Vigraha Tattva and Jati Buddhi and Vaishnavas and many other things that are relevant to the practical life of sadhakas and their engagement socially and engagement in personal relationships and things like that. So that's where we are in our overall progress through the text. So I'll conclude here for today. If anyone has comments, questions, corrections, or anything else, please feel free. Yes.
Pranam Baba.
Pranam.
I have maybe a silly question. On the scale of disregard or disdain, where would mukti fall in terms of, because listening to this, it almost seemed like it was like, how one would have, as a devotee, tries to avoid material enjoyment. And so would mukti fall in a similar category, would you say? Because when hearing your presentation, what came to my mind is when Haridas Thakur was meditating and Maya Devi came to him and he was able to enlighten her. So in terms of mukti, where would it be on the scale of disregard?
Well, we would make a distinction between Sayujya Mukti and the other 4 categories of mukti. In the case of Sayujya Mukti, you could say that, from one perspective, you'd say it's the ultimate object of disregard, because if someone achieves or undergoes Sayujya Mukti, there's no further premise for engagement in bhakti for eternity. So arguably, you could say that is to be avoided even more scrupulously than even aparad. I mean, from one perspective, in the sense that if you committed aparad, you could still suffer the consequence and again become a bhakta. But if you enter the state of Sayujya Mukti, there's no coming back. So if one's fundamental premise is that their aim is bhakti, then the acceptance of Sayujya Mukti is just literally antithetical. So in that sense, that category would definitely be avoided. It's sort of like slipping into a black hole or something like this. But as we discussed in the previous class, if it comes to the other 4 categories of mukti, then Rupa Goswami explains that in contexts where acceptance of them is not in any way a detriment to the service that bhaktas are rendering to Bhagavan, then acceptance of them is permissible and in one sense natural. And there are so many bhaktas who live in the world of samsara and at some point accept some variety of moksha and enter Vaikuntha or enter Goloka or what have you. So in that sense, moksha is disregarded as a purushartha, but it's not actually disregarded as an object that could be accepted. So when it comes to those four categories, you could say the disregard is conditional. If it came to be that although, let me go back a step. We heard this statement earlier that even if Bhagavan comes and offers the bhaktas moksha they don't accept, then that's in the context of that they don't accept moksha as their purushartha or as the ultimate boon that they receive from Bhagavan. But in the case of, let's say, Dhruva Maharaj, who is blessed by Bhagavan to have bhakti, who then lives out the boon that he gets from Bhagavan, and then finally this Vaikuntha airplane descends and says, okay, now it's time for you to accept moksha and go to Vaikuntha, then what does he do? He steps on the head of death and discards his body and ascends into the airplane and goes off to Vaikuntha. We've heard Baba many times passionately recount. So in that sense, the bhakta is readily, mounting the stairs. He's confidently accepting moksha. But he's doing so because in that context, he has full conviction that this is how he can best engage in bhakti to Bhagavan at that time, at that stage, that this is what Bhagavan wants, that this is the next step in the unfolding of his bhakti. So all these statements that mention that bhaktas don't accept all these types of moksha, they never accept sayuja mukti, but the other categories, they don't desire, so to speak, independent of bhakti, but they will accept should those things be advantageous to bhakti. So in that sense, they're not absolute objects of disregard, but they're disregarded as being principal objects of aspiration. So does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Baba, I have other questions.
Okay.
All right, I'll just follow up on this point. Does this really happen that mukti is offered to a Vaishnava who is desiring to go to, let's say, Goloka Vrindavan? We read it in the scriptures, but I don't really see that happening. Why would Krishna do that? Why would Krishna offer us that if we don't want that?
Well, in the case of Prahlad Maharaj, there's this statement in the 10th chapter where the word pralobhyamana is used, that Bhagavan tempted him with boons. So in that sense, it's not that Bhagavan was really offering it to him, but Bhagavan was taking pleasure in seeing how Prahlad rejected. In other words, it's sort of like we hear in the Rasa Leela how the gopis are dancing with Krishna. They're profoundly expressing love for Krishna in so many ways, but nevertheless, Krishna wanted to force it out of their mouths. In other words, he wanted to make them say it too. So he disappears, and then they all cry and sing all about him, and he hides in the bushes and listens. If we just boil it down a little bit bluntly, where just to say that Bhagavan sometimes takes pleasure in seeing bhaktas articulate certain intense feelings that they have. So there could be an instance where Bhagavan, and it's interpreted by some of the commentators, that Nrsimhadev offers Prahlad moksha, not really because that was his way of trying to benefit Prahlad, but more he was so confident and had so much adoration for Prahlad's bhakti that this was a way of relishing that bhakti. So similarly, it may be seen that in the life of some sadhakas, there may be some instance in which like a quote-unquote test is presented, or the option is presented, and it's just for the sake of bringing out a solidified expression of their resoluteness in bhakti, that sort of dynamic comes about. So in that way, I would just say that it's possible.
I kind of see it as a symbolic thing. I'm trying to think for a Vaishnava. I mean, I'm not much of a Vaishnava, but what would Krishna offer? Let's say Krishna offers me freedom from all suffering. That sounds fabulous. But that's not going to get me any closer to what I want, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are just kind of, and I'm trying to think of a circumstance where a Vaishnava would accept one of the 4 types of mukti out of frustration. I mean, I'm just talking through this, that let's say you're thinking, I want Braj Bhakti. It's so difficult to attain. It is so rare. What are the chances? I don't know. Maybe I would accept Vaikuntha instead. But I think the point you've made before in these classes is that the devotee, he's experiencing so much relish, right, from bhakti, that he's not going to be dissuaded by something like this. Is that right?
Maybe, hopefully. I mean, there are, in the Sindhu, we also hear about 3 categories of shanti, rati, and in some cases, there's a fluidity between bhakti to Krishna, bhakti to Ram, bhakti to Nrsimha, bhakti to Narayan. The rati is like a crystal. It doesn't have any specific color. It's just clear. So it reflects whatever is in its context. So for persons with rati like that, they might be Krishna bhaktas. There was a Krishna deity in their village or in their home, so they're chanting the name of Krishna. But in the course of that, ultimately, they're blessed with, Narayan blesses them with Mokṣa, and Jai Ho, they succeed, In other words, there could be a context like that in a situation where that very generic category of rati is what is on the table, so to speak. But for persons who are following the sadhana path of, taught in the Sindhu of the Goswamis, the Raganuga path, the idea of aspiring for a specified category of bhav to a specified ishta devata, then in that case, no, someone wouldn't, say, oh, I'll just give up, and accept something else or some other category of things. If they've been educated in what the path is and the nature of the goal that they're aspiring to, then they'll say, well, however long it takes to get it and however far I am from it, it's worth whatever trouble I have to go through. So, that would be another side for another category of sadhaka.
Right. And then just my last point, I noted in the references that you translated, there's reference to needing a body. And I thought that was interesting because I don't think very seriously about losing my body when I die and the consequences of being in a situation where I don't have a body. It didn't occur to me, but I thought that maybe that should occur to me, that, well, the body is very useful for practicing sadhana bhakti. If I don't have one, I'm going to be in a fix. So.
Yeah, generally speaking, I mean, the body is essential to performing acts of sadhana. But one caveat you could say to that is that for persons who are educated by Rupa Goswami, even when they become disembodied, they'll still know how to do smarnanga bhakti. They'll still know how to do some form of bhakti, even that's mental or meditational. So that'll give you great peace while you pass through that disembodied state. So another great benefit of being a follower of Rupa Goswami, this kind of clarity you'll get.
All right, thank you.
But, certainly, ideally and in principle, it's through an embodied state that one engages in this path and progresses forward. This is the norm, if you will. So that's well understood.
Right. Thank you.
All right. So, are we good for tonight?
Yes.
So, okay. So we'll conclude here, and in our next reading, we'll jump into some extended discussion of Bhagavad Dharma Tattva. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Shri.
Thank you.